Aspects in astrology. What is a grand trine? I'm Sukboy. You're awesome. I forecast these transits one day ahead so you can set your intentions accordingly. Compare and contrast these aspects to that of your own natal or birth chart for further nuance, for further insight. Let's talk about it. Following the 28-day lunation cycle, on this day, I have a perfect example or opportunity to explain to you the dynamics of a grand trine. Now, the moon moves rather quickly, but at some point today, around 12 o'clock Australian time, the moon at 12 degrees of Scorpio will be trining with 19 degrees Saturn in Pisces, and Saturn will be trining with Mars retrograde 17 degrees in Cancer, and then back up to the moon. We call this a grand trine. It's in the water element. Let's break it down. Now, grand trines are an equilateral triangle, and they're made up of three separate trines between three different planetary bodies, all around 120 degrees. Now, within this aspect pattern, all three planets have the ability to make a testimony, to communicate rather fluidly, an easy flow of energy between each of the planetary bodies. That's what a grand trine is. It is rather favorable. Context is everything. Yes, this is a favorable aspect. Now, if you find it in your birth chart or you read it in someone else's birth chart, yes, it is quite good. However, it is not generating the same amount of energy that the harsher or hard aspects are, like squares or oppositions. There's no tension, there's no friction. So we need those things to create energy or generate a lot of attention so we can actually motivate ourselves to transform, evolve, and change. So therefore, often these easy aspects can be taken for granted and we can be quite lazy with them. Now, before I jump into my interpretation of this particular grand trine, so you can follow along, for my advanced astrologers, yes, we have mutual reception. The moon rules Cancer, so the moon is ruling over that Mars in Cancer, and Mars rules Scorpio, so Mars is ruling over that moon in Scorpio. Mutual reception, it's kind of like a conjunction, but not quite. Drop some knowledge if you'd like me to elaborate on mutual reception. Emotional depth, creativity, healing, and intuition. This is a water grand trine, so immediately we know some of the themes that will be covered when we try to interpret this particular trine that is in the elemental core value of water. Now, you've got to take the good with the bad, the yin and the yang, and there are also shadow aspects of the water element. So this could indicate to us that this situation might be too sensitive. It could have a theme of escapism, or perhaps someone in this situation is conflict avoidant. It's important always to take into consideration both sides of the story. Now, the moon and Cancer are involved, and so immediately we know that emotional depth or sophistication is involved. Now, the moon is in Scorpio, so that indicates that these emotions could be kept private or guarded, and they will be instinctual in nature. They may have an ambition behind them. They might have an intent, so to speak. Now, it's deeply intuitive and it's very sensitive to deception and secrets. It can hold its own secrets. Therefore, it could project onto others and assume that others have secrets or are being deceptive in some way, shape, or form. Again, this is an emotional intensity and it's prone to secrecy. So therefore, it manifests sometimes as the inability to trust others. So there could be trust issues involved. Ultimately, Moon in Scorpio is trying to emotionally transform a situation. Now, that could happen on an instinctual, unconscious, or subconscious level, or it could mean that in private, it is trying to investigate a situation, a relationship, an event, and ultimately transform that in some way, shape, or form, uncovering hidden truths, so to speak. Now, the moon is in its fall while it's in Scorpio, so we do need to consider those negative aspects. On the flip side, it could be very powerful, very ambitious, very driven. Moon in Scorpio can also be very alluring, determined, and resourceful. Let's look at Mars in Cancer next. Now, that's Mars in retrograde, so it's already, we know that it's somewhat reflective. It might be going over old themes, reprocessing, retracing its steps, so to speak. To be noted, Mars is also in its fall while it's in Cancer, so we need to consider those negative aspects. This means it can hold grudges, it can be moody and emotionally turbulent, but you may not know because it's extremely passive-aggressive and somewhat conflict avoidant until it's not. Now, both the moon and Cancer in general are probably the least objective planetary energetics you'll find in the zodiac. So Mars is no different while it's in Cancer. It's a very subjective kind of energetic you're looking at. It really does lack that objectivity. Cancer at its core, though, is really nurturing and protective. And Mars, the god of war, will be trying to assert itself in some way, shape, or form in the name of protecting the family, protecting the emotional security of itself and others. It can really bottle up anger and be quite defensive, though, so be careful of that. And again, because it's retrograde, it's even more so internalizing some kind of anger or negative emotion potentially. So I guess you're starting to get the drift that just because this is a grand trine and it is a favorable aspect pattern, it doesn't mean that it's all good. You do need to consider the shadow side of these elements, especially when you consider their position and their condition. Let's get into Saturn next. Now, Saturn in Pisces is really trying to structure the unconscious and the subconscious patterns, behaviors that you may have created over the years. It is quite restrictive to elements of Pisces in that it does not just want to fantasize and imagine abstract content or conceptual material. It really wants to bring the form, that imagination, into reality. It wants to make it tangible, concrete existence. Because it's a water sign, we are talking about emotions. It's also getting energetics from the moon and Mars. So there is an emotional resilience or discipline that can be shown here. Finally, Saturn is also about our accumulated experiences. So it is quite aware of karmic lessons. It does know the consequences for its actions. Now, it can be on the receiving end of that authority, the consequence, or it can be dishing out that authority or that consequence. So basically, that Saturn will be stabilizing the energetics of both the moon emotions and Mars actions. Now, Mars is in retrograde, meaning that it is already kind of hesitant in the ability to act. So the Mars retrograde actually softens that Saturn's presence of, creating structure, creating boundaries, or imposing its authority. That doesn't take away the emotional weight. The moon in Scorpio is really, really intense. And so what may be occurring is there is a transformation internally, and these things are being formulated in the mind rather than acted upon. It doesn't mean the energy doesn't exist. Yes, the moon in Scorpio will still make this a very emotional event. If anything, Saturn in Pisces could make this moon in Scorpio rather complacent emotionally as well. Again, it's going to be imposing some kind of structure, some kind of order. So it could be self-suffering, self-sacrifice. In a nutshell, this water grand trine is generating a lot of energy. It's very important to be aware, not to be paranoid, or not to be too hesitant or conflict avoidant. Now, if you've got any questions, drop some knowledge, let me know. Hope that helps. Okay, bye.